All right. Hello.
Hello.
My name is Anzovin, and I've been animating professionally for 20 plus years, and just like everyone else, spline interpolated keyframes have been my bread and butter for most of that time. The three of us are here to tell you this is actually bad and we should throw it away. We're each going to do a brief introduction to ourselves and our techniques.
Oh no, did we lose Raph?
Oh no, we're doomed. Just kidding. But he did have the slides up. All right. Well. Hi. Well, Raph is coming back online. I'm Brad Clark. Blender troublemaker lately, but we've been. I've been dealing with mocap and dense data and interpolationless animation for a long time. So.
Hey, am I back? Can you guys hear me?
Convince you. Yep.
Oh man! All right, internet connection problems. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. If you want to keep going, Brad, feel free. I can.
I was just gonna say, I've been on the animation tech side for years, and cross paths with various techniques, and started out very much reliant on the graph editor, and then quickly realized that was a painful path when dealing with thousands of moves with dense animation. So hopefully this will help you out. Onward.
Did he freeze again?
He might have. All right.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, all right.
We're good.
You got it, Raph. It's okay.
All right. Am I back now?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. This is going wonderfully. Anyway, basically, we're going to try to do this as a panel. And so the idea is, all you people who are watching this, start thinking of questions while we're talking, and we're going to do these brief introductions and to our techniques, and then we really want to have our discussion driven by you guys to a great degree. So anyway, I will get on with the introduction, because this has been going so smoothly, and if I suddenly drop offline again, I apologize. So anyway, the point of interpolated animation is to reduce movement to a limited set of adjustable parameters, i.e. keyframes. That's great for what it was originally designed for, which is to edit motion of objects with few moving parts and easily parameterizable motion, and it becomes increasingly difficult to manage when you have to animate any character that isn't a bouncy ball or a Luxo lamp. The problem is that there is no combination of keyframes and rig state that is guaranteed to be effective both for creating and for editing a performance. The choices you make early on will paint you into a corner later. And a persistent rig also requires you to build every possible type of interaction the animator might want into the same rig, leading to runaway rig complexity and the need to manage rig state, like FKIK switches and space switches across time manually. We all know how much fun that is. All of this means massive additional cognitive load for the animator, and it gets in the way of the process of actually creating a performance. Dense animation, which is what we're going to be talking about today, defines movement as a set of discrete poses across time. And all the kinds of tools that we're familiar with for editing poses and motion, they're not parameters anymore. They're not baked into your shot. They are instead effectively tools, and they let you perform similar actions to the types of manipulation that we're familiar with, but they don't have the implications for how you can edit that data in the future. So dense animation aims to improve animation iteration speed, remove barriers between the animator and what they're working on, allow flexibility in choice of tools for editing motion, make it easy to edit motion that's already been polished, and to make it easy to edit motion from mocap and procedural sources, which are already dense data, and so they fit really awkwardly into the keyframe workflow. So here's some useful analogies. I'm old enough that I actually remember when people used to use NURBS to model characters. We don't do that anymore, but even with polygonal or subdivision modeling, you still have the concept of a sparse set of control points that you're going to use to edit the surface. And you would naively expect that to pretty much always be the right thing. That's sort of what comes naturally when you're doing things with computer graphics. And yet, micropolygons and voxels, ZBrush and 3D Code and all of the sculpting tools that have grown up surrounding that workflow, that allow editing the surface arbitrarily without concern for topology, completely took over in terms of characters. And I think that says something about the value of interpolated control points. So I want to now turn it over to Richard, who's the lead animator at Polyarc and who has been doing a lot to push forward these kinds of techniques. and to discuss how he approaches using dense animation. And I'm going to turn off sharing my screen, and you can now share yours.
All right, let's make this happen. I'm going to press some buttons here and see what happens with the buttons. There we go. So we all seeing this? Yes?
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Get a thumbs up. All right. Thanks, Raph. I appreciate it, man. Again, my name's Lico, Richard Lico, whatever you want to call me. It depends on if you're a bill collector or not. I'm animation director at PolyArt Games and the Animation Sherpa. I've been animating for 21 years now, which I think makes it so my career can legally drink. That's a good thing. Most of my time animating in this industry has been using a space switching workflow. And I call it space switching, even though that's a terrible name. I know you guys probably also space switch when you workflow, but what I'm talking about is something a little different because it doesn't include a bunch of custom attributes and a heavy rig to do it. So what do I mean by space switching? In my world, space switching is essentially animation jujitsu, where you kind of use the existing motion to kind of help you make new motion. And it makes the hierarchy of the rig fluid, allowing you to alter the hierarchy as you animate. This way, your motion becomes the parent, and the hierarchy becomes the child. But what does it do, right? Why would I do that? Well, it's really, on a basic level, how to ever avoid counter-animating again. Just, it goes away. You don't ever have to do that again. And it simplifies how you manipulate your rig controls and even view your curve data if you use a graph editor or turn things into motion paths or however you want to, view your motion. But on a more complex level, it allows you to automate complex physical animation, detail, and texture. It's kind of like generating mocap, but without mocap, where you can kind of build it in using that existing motion. And you can also control the performance. Obviously that's important. But you don't need to manually do it. Because you know how you have these, monolithic rigs with like thousands of attributes that go like 2 frames a second inside of Maya, right? And essentially those workflows are all about how you spend your time doing every little bit of control by hand, manually. But this workflow takes a lot of that burden off of your plate and allows you to kind of focus more on directing performances. And now I'm going to hand it back to you, Raph. So let me figure out how to do this. Stop streaming.
All right. Yeah, here we go. There we go. It's me again. The approach that I take is what I refer to as ephemeral rigging. And what you're seeing here is an excerpt from an ongoing project animated using my ephemeral rig system. The system is ephemeral because the body control rig is just a program that runs on manipulation. And the moment the mouse has been released, the rig literally no longer exists, at least the control rig. The version you're going to see here is the 3rd version of the ephemeral rig system, which was written with Tagore Smith of Notional Pipe. Because the ephemeral rig system rebuilds the rig constantly, it allows for quick switching of manipulation modes. I have them all just bound to keys, and I'm constantly switching them as I pose, which makes posing very fast. Since the control rig is custom built for every single interaction, this allows for seemingly circular behavior without actually breaking circularities. It's not actually circular, you're just actually really doing 2 different rigs. It's just very transparent to the animator. I think of this system as being a spatial approach to dense animation data, as opposed to Rick's temporal approach. Since I'm editing individual poses as since I'm editing individual poses as opposed to editing across time. I don't know why I wrote that. That's a ridiculous tongue twister. Anyway, I'm animating just like a traditional animator, treating poses like they were drawings. However, these approaches shouldn't have to be separate. That they are right now is just an artifact of building this on top of Maya's keyframe system, which is, not really built to do this, and so we've taken different paths in trying to make it more flexible. To actually animate with this system, as opposed to just making a single pose, you generate new poses through built-in in-between tools. It's important to note that the system makes no actual distinction between key and in-between poses once they're created. They're all just poses. And those poses can be biased or smoothed with surrounding poses, but those are just tools that edit them. To visualize that motion, I'm using onion skins rather than a graph editor. And because of that, because there aren't across-time editing tools, this makes the current system most useful for cartoony animation that's going to be on 1s and 2s. But if the temporal and spatial approaches were merged, I really believe this approach would actually be the right thing for all character animation, including highly realistic animation. And now I'll hand you to Brad Clark from Rigging Dojo, who has already, I think, had an opportunity to introduce himself. And he's been promoting these ideas for a long time. And to some degree, the ephemeral system partly came out of me finally realizing what he was getting at and listening to what he was saying.
All right, so let me share and go live. All right, so I've been breaking things for 20 years, and that means, you know, software and workflows. I started with the traditional love of animation and watching Glenn Keane flip drawings and you know, watching the Disney stuff and looking at that going, man, that's amazing. I can't draw, and I end up in 3D, right? Like, you know, and then I was like, well, I'm going to animate, and then I was technical and ended up rigging. So, you know, I quickly ended up kind of off track from just regular animation where Raph and Rick stayed. But, you know, I ended up back in motion capture, which is a pretty good balance of traditional, you know, technical skills of rigging and all the fundamentals of animation to make that stuff work. And after years of working this way, you know, I talked to Raph and I talked to people about this, and they're like, oh yeah, how do you deal with all those big keys? And you know, you've seen ephemeral and you've seen some space switching concept ideas, and Richard's put up a lot of information about space switching, and the reactions are always like, oh, I want to use this right now, or I can't use it. But why are you animating the way you are? Well, if we look back to like 84, 85, we pretty much need to blame Pixar and John Lasseter. He produced a SIGGRAPH paper, Principles of Traditional Animation, that came out, and everyone was like, oh, you know, Disney guy doing cool stuff, and it's, you know, Pixar. And then people just kept teaching the same process, which was like, you know, grab the character, wiggle the hips, make that look like a bouncing ball, and spread that out across the whole rig. And you think back at the time and like, well, why did he do that? And that's because they had an FK character. It wasn't, they didn't have IK systems, they didn't have fast computers, they didn't have real-time playback. He was working the way he was because of the limitations of the hardware. It wasn't even pose to pose or straight ahead. It was like just layered approach because you have an FK system to counter animate the whole time. All animators today, you know, you see students working on animation, and the overwhelming response is always, don't let the computer do the work for you. And then there's Graph Editor on Twitter causing trouble, always wanting you to spline your work and destroy everything. And, you know, the talks from this talk and many others, animators are very much like, well, stay in blocking as long as possible, right? Don't let the computer take over. Stay with the poses for as long as possible. Do real pose to pose. And many computer animators may not even know what pose to pose really means, which means the pose itself contains all of the information, the overlap, the drag, all of the principles should be in the pose. Hint, you get that 100% out of mocap. So why does everyone cling to FK workarounds from 30 years ago? Because Lasseter did it? I hope not. But mainly it's because that's what is continually taught. So if you're trying to understand the system and you want to see it, how do I apply it to my workflow day to day? Do I have to throw everything out? No, of course not. But I learned something years ago. We had a Disney animator come in, and we were required to teach him 3D. And the first question was, well, why do I have to care? Like, I just draw the character. I just move the character and draw it wherever I want. Why do I have to think about what moves first and hierarchy and pivots? And I was like, yeah, you know what? You're right. Why do you have to do that? Because the computer expects you to work the way that the computer wants you to work. It expects you to start in a certain order, and it's going to transform things based on hierarchy. And the ephemeral system throws all that out the window, and Richard's system of basically always moving the animation curve to the best space to manipulate it throws that all out too. It doesn't matter where the pivot is. What matters is where the data is and how the motion is being manipulated. So, you know, if you think about what this looks like, this old Pixar interface is a spreadsheet. Each keyframe, each value is isolated in its own little column. You know, here, if you looked at traditional animation tools or, you know, a 3D tool, it's basically a spreadsheet. Whatever is in this column, in column B for frame 2, if I change that, nothing happens to frame 3. Nothing happens to frame 4. Everything is isolated in its own little container. What does that look like? Maybe clips in a nonlinear animation package, but we'll get there. Another way to think of this is a stack of drawings, right? If Glenn Keane draws a drawing of Ariel on one page, and then he flips the drawing down and traces over it and adjusts it, and decides that the rig suddenly doesn't work, right? That paper is containing all of the information for that drawing, and he can throw it away and not destroy the rest of the animation. You can change where the character is or what she's doing or how she's moving, and none of it impacts the surrounding frames. He's got complete control over that, and it's instantaneous. He doesn't have to go, oh man, I hope I don't gimbal lock. So Ephemeral's been here all along. It's just animation. Computer animators have maybe forgotten what actually animating means or looks like, but there are certain groups that haven't. Brad Bird went to Pixar and was like, I don't want to let the computer do the work. You know, he's got this great quote, it wants things to be small and weightless, hard to touch. We're fighting it every step of the way. Like, this is him going to Pixar after all the years of 2D animation going, how do you work this way? Glenn Keane has talked about sculptural drawing in animation. And when he started to do some early 2D, 3D tests, he got hooked, I think, right? The soul of creative art form is the freedom. You aren't free when you're locked to a rig that forces you to work a certain way. And you can see that this was impacting the quality of the work. There's no greater example of the difference, traditional 3D animation workflow, how it creates a certain look. When you look at Rapunzel, when he's drawing over the frames of this, you know, you can see the 2D drawing of him, what he expects this pose to look like, and what the 3D software was encouraging the animator to do, right? You're not free if the rig is dictating the end performance because you are limited by the way the rig wants to interpolate. Now, SIGGRAPH presented this great talk, and you know, he's like, oh, early on, it doesn't work for VFX. Well, I'm going to tell you right now that as long as I've been in the industry, and from the first day that Giant Software was formed in the 90s, all of the mocap data that makes Gollum or Avatar films possible is sample-based. It eventually ends up in Maya, and there are animators animating, and there are great people doing all of the final touches, but every single source data for all these films, including the cinematic universe of Marvel, if it goes through a Weta pipeline or a mocap pipeline, you are sample-based. The interpolation is thrown out. You're pure pose to pose, you're capturing the frame as it is, and the software that Giant created is samples. You modify a frame, and it doesn't impact the rest of the frames because it's isolated by a clip. Samples, not splines. And what does that look like if you think about the source Valve engine? Their cinematic machine editor, where you kind of can re-time and readjust the curves. Think about like audio tools, right? Like those are samples that are being manipulated by tools. You're not changing something that breaks as far as the curve goes, right? Like if you have a sparse curve and you have 3 keyframes and you move 1 keyframe, you've changed the entire animation over the entire length of the timeline. Sometimes that's great. And sometimes you're going to want that, but not every time, and not when you're trying to work on a nuanced performance where, you know, you're focused on the face on this section and you realize you've broken something somewhere else. So how does this work in games? I rigged the Epic Mickey character for Epic Game for the Disney game Epic Mickey, and the tools from MotionBuilder and the space switching workflow is what I built into this rig. And so while it was typically animated, you know, spline based and everything, when the final animation was supposed to match 2D cartoon animation, you can't rely on traditional workflows. You see these extreme squash and stretch examples. You see this like behavior that's happening, and that's because the rig let the animators, just like Richard's system, push all of the animation curves to world space. And so at any point in time, the animator could push a button and move all the controls to world space and repose the character without messing anything up, no counter animation, and pop it back. So it interpolated like normal, but at any moment in time, you could adjust and edit any final frame, even on a finished animation. So the other part of this is understanding how to animate, right? Raft's system is going to look hard to work with pose by pose if you're at 60 frames a second. But it's not about FPS. It's about animating to the style. So for film and VFX, you're not going to have necessarily animation on twos. Spider-Verse did an amazing job, right? They came out and everyone was like, wow, this is amazing. It created a textural field that fit the style. Spider-Man Miles Morales, they turned on a post-process to make it feel like twos, and it worked pretty well because you're in a game format. But Dragon Prince Season 1 came out, and they actually just got an Emmy, by the way, which is awesome. But their first season had a huge negative reaction because it was trying to do something like animating on twos, and it caused visually people not to be happy with it, right? And that's because you can't just simply animate and pose like it's going to interpolate. And that's why Raft's ghosting workflow is so important. You have to know visually, if I move the hand, right, when you do a cartoon, you have to smear it if you don't have motion blur. And if you're trying to create a stop motion effect, even in stop motion, like Paranorman, right, like the Lico guys, they build the smears into their models in stop motion to create fast feelings. So you have to think beyond just, I'm going to interpolate and just bake everything on twos and step it. You have to actually animate to the style. And just like 2D animators, if you're going to animate on twos and then you have detail, you got to go to ones, and then you have to fill in the detail, and you have to think about the spacing, not just the timing. So where do we go? Ubisoft has done amazing research on in-betweening from sparse data. So Raft's system is built upon the idea that you're in-betweening from, other sources of poses, and you've got these tools that let you work on the current pose you're working on, but not a good way to push that out across time. The in-betweening tools from Ubisoft and Side Effects released their new rigging solution as basically treating animation as individual snapshots of geometry. If you took the animation and spread it out in ZBrush as a bunch of models and then sculpted the animation and compressed it back into a skeleton, you've got amazing tools to manipulate data the same way you could with like a Houdini procedural system, or better in-betweening, right? If you have sparse data and you want to fill that in with AI and let the AI help interpolate, but with your own set of poses, then you start to see where we can maybe take these tools that are currently limited and start to expand on them. MotionBuilder, I did this a long time ago, and I'm just going to let this play, and you can, if you think about a clip-based system, how do I try this out right now? Well, if in Maya you're using the time editor and the poses, or using clips inside of MotionBuilder, you can basically isolate the animation into individual clips. So I'm going to jump forward real quick. So here I've got individual poses that are generating, each pose creates a clip, and that clip isolates it just like a drawing from everything else. And now I can retime the drawings, I can reinterpolate them, and at any point I can bake all of it down and export it back to a game engine, and it's going to interpolate as curves. But while I'm working, I shouldn't be worrying about the output. Just like the sub-D surfaces, you worry about topology after you get the form. Our current animation tools require you to worry about everything all the time and manage it. And the tech debt of working to manage your rig and clean up the curves versus working on performance, I think is detrimental to increasing the quality of fast turnaround animation. And it's limiting to high-end animation, where you're getting more and more data that is sampled from real life. So other ways to explore: amazing tools in Blender. I did a Blender talk about getting from Maya to Blender. If you're interested in trying it, you can see that this Aardman style animation here, every frame is a new sculpture, and you don't need to worry about the rig in the previous frame or the current frame. You just sculpt and animate, and you can mix it with traditional rigging like he's done here, right? The eyes and the head are basically rigged, but the sculpture each frame is independent. So you can do stop motion and CG animation, you know, intertwined. They've got these amazing pose brushes. I joke all the time on Twitter that, you know, we basically should just get rid of the rig at this point and let them sculpt and animate directly on the mesh. Well, Pablo has done these amazing IK tools that let you define pre-existing masks and basically just rig the mesh and your model, and then you can use the sculpt brushes to pose it and, you know, key mesh basically, right? You've got an IK tool in the sculpt brush. So that's where you can start to look at this stuff and see how to apply it directly and play with it as an experiment. And until Raph gets all his tools written up nicely as an awesome add-on to Maya and or Unreal or whatever you work in. But hopefully that gives you a clear path to start thinking about, oh, this stuff isn't so weird. I can actually use this right now today and improve the workflow and start to get your tech guys and your rigging team to make you some awesome animation tools. All right, that's it for me. I'm gonna.
Yep. Do you want to advance to the next one, because we should just maybe keep that stuff up on the screen, like the right. So like we have some question prompts just about like what you know, some of the things we expect people might want to ask us about, but we really want to answer your actual specific questions. So this is just sort of a general guide. Okay.
Okay, our first audience question: how does space switching or ephemeral rigging work with animation layers?
So right now the techniques treat that problem actually very differently, although I think they're kind of the same thing underneath. But do you want to take that first, Rick? Since you, of course, sometimes use animation layers as part of your workflow, which is a different sort of answer than I would give.
Yeah, I mean, switching a hierarchy when you have a layer can be tricky, right? So I think what you do is you make custom hierarchies per layer, and then it allows you to work in however many layers you want in that situation. But I think it is a tricky thing because you're relegated to how Maya tends to function. Like if you try and work in 3 different layers with 3 different hierarchies, it tends to get kind of wonky. So what I do is I'll work, you know, I'll keep switching spaces in one layer and then bake that down. And then now each layer that I'm working on, and I add a new layer, the base functionality of that layer is all going to be the same. But when I'm working in whatever new layer I'm working in, I just switch however I want. I do whatever hierarchy changes I want, bake it back down to the starting format, and then that's how the layer is stored. So that's how I tend to work with it. What do you guys like? How do you guys do it?
So what I would say is that the ultimate promise of dense animation data and the idea of having tools that you can use to edit things across time in like a way that doesn't require workarounds in Maya, the ultimate promise of that is actually that it replaces animation layers. Because the point of having an animation layer is you have something with high frequency motion, and you want a couple of points that you can use to have some parameters to adjust that motion. But the problem with animation layers, from my point of view, is that you have you have those things sticking around, and this is the central problem of like, well, I chose these particular places to put my keyframes on my animation layer that goes above my high frequency animation, and now I'm stuck with them. Right? I can bake it down, but then I lose my ability to like have some points to do that. So the ephemeral point of view on that would be that what the tool should actually let you do is at any time say, I'm going to range across time, and I'm going to choose some points, and I'm going to edit those, and it's going to make the data respond appropriately. But the moment I move something, that's now the data has changed. It's destructive. But this is actually a good thing in this case. It's destructive the same way painting is destructive, or working in ZBrush is destructive, right? One of the things that I think like is sort of like the higher level sort of philosophical implications of some of this stuff that's important to note is that parameterizing things isn't always good, and we tend to assume that it is because it is often really, really good, but a lot of the time it's not. And character animation, I think, is an example where what you get for having persistent animation layers is not worth it for the trouble they ultimately cause you.
Well, I'll add to that is that years ago, a very, very smart TD was saying, you know, animation layers should bring on the simplification of the rig. You shouldn't have so many attributes and controls that are accumulating to give you an end result. And I think the biggest thing that both of the workflows create is the fact that you don't have the technical overhead of wondering, well, is this math problem of root control plus world control plus, butt wiggle shape plus, the stacking of all of the controls to produce the final picture? You don't have to decipher that across 5 different channels of animation. It is exactly what you see. What you see is what you get in that pose from that control. And that control's pivot is just there to provide you a anchor point for where the transform is. It's not about how it's manipulated or how it gets to that pose. And I think the space switching workflow allows you to reflow the animation into whatever structure you need and still keep all of the curves as what you expect, right?
It's
world space.
Temporary spaces. Yeah. So
it moves the animation.
Yeah, like a traditional rig, you're saving all of your data in that rig all the time, and all those spaces are different attributes, right? So working in different layers can be cumbersome, and you can save the layers and all that kind of stuff. But if you get out of the mindset of needing to save all of that data and then just get used to I'm going to work in this space now, I'm going to work in this layer now, and I'm just going to collapse it back down and then keep making spatial changes or keep adding new layers or just keep collapsing, baking back down, confirming, and then making sure everything's temporary, then none of that matters anymore.
Right, and I think that's that kind of, I don't know if the spatial versus temporal terminology that I'm using here is clear to people, but that's what the difference is, right? What you're talking about, that ability to basically have what amounts to a temporary animation layer, is very related to what I'm doing. It's just that I'm treating it as something you do for a single pose. You're treating it as something you do across time. And so ultimately, yeah, I mean, animation layers in that context should give you the function, the good things you get from animation layers now without all the bad consequences that accrue from them, basically. But our tools are still working around the way Maya works right now.
Cool. Okay, so next question. We have a question from an Anim Tools developer. Their question is, interpolated poses are generated based on the rigs you use, so they're thinking about making a workflow where you can inverse solve any rig onto any poses and choose a range of frames and click generate interpolation. What do you think about that? Is there a better way to do that, or would that work in theory?
So that's not, in some ways, that's kind of similar to how the ephemeral system works now. I don't yet have a generate multiple in-betweens at once button because it's still under development, but, if I'm going and making breakdowns, it's a pretty similar concept. The thing that I would say there is that there's an easier concept than talking about inverse solving to rigs. I mean, that's been a topic of conversation a lot, inverse solving to different kinds of rigs. If your base state, and this is how the ephemeral system works, of all of your controllers is just a bunch of transforms in world space, and the manipulation of those transforms is effectively a temporary rig, then the problem of inverse solving to different rigs doesn't really exist, because you're always expecting to essentially construct them at manipulation time out of these transforms. And then when you're done, they just become transforms in world space. You don't need to think about how the different types of rigs, and they really are effectively kind of separate rigs, but you don't really need to think about how they relate to each other. You only need to think about how to generate from world space transforms and push back to world space transforms when you're done.
If I understand that correctly, though, I think where that would be good is if you're in middle of trying to convert between 2 pipelines, right? Having the ability to or mix workflows, right? Where, just like right now, you have animators that are straight ahead FK people and people that want to put their rig in IK mode and IK pose to pose. Both of those type of approaches are supported in the current workflow of Maya, 3D software. Where you want to be able to have an exit is you don't want to rely on that methodology based on, well, my rig doesn't have this feature. I have to update the feature. I have to change the rig. I have to copy the animation. I need to push the change. And now a week later, you've got the fix for the shot that should have been done. So, being able to kind of inverse solve to a more world space freeform animation switch could be cool. And it would be something to look at beyond just, only Raf's approach or only Richard's space switch style, but I'd have, you know, the devil's in the details of how that gets implemented.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, and again, I mean, I've mentioned this before, but like these two approaches shouldn't really have to be separate. Like they only are right now because of the issues with implementing them in the context of the software we have.
Well, and it can be a post process as well, right? Like you can have a free-form rig state and then solve to a final target, just like a retargeting problem. And
sure.
You know, anybody who's ever tried to animate keyframes in MotionBuilder, you have MotionBuilder defaults. For anybody who doesn't know, when you build a rig or HIK in Maya or whatever it is, their control rig structure is a FK system and a world space IK system. And so when people first try to animate the way they would expect to a Maya rig that, you know, like a foot roll has a parent in the relationship of that animation, it freaks them out because like now they edit something and now the wrist is on a linear interpolation because it's IK and they didn't realize it, right? So, you know, having the two systems is flexible in MotionBuilder, but you still end up with kind of an interpolation problem at some point. But being able to solve that to whatever solution you want at the end would be cool. Like, who cares how the poses are generated? But you know, you can always retarget it as a post process. And Houdini's kind of doing that with joint orientation now in KineFX. You know, their rig doctor node basically goes, oh, you have a bunch of points that are and edges that are a collection for skeletons. Great. Well, when you export it, it needs joint orients to match Maya. Okay, well, we'll fix that and spit that out. But we don't care until then.
I think that KineFX is actually a really interesting example in that they're also thinking about motion data as like, well, it's just a bunch of points in space. And they've been very successful at solving a bunch of problems people have all the time by doing that. Yeah, next question, I guess.
Okay, our next one.
Unless Richard, do you have anything?
Oh, unless you have something to say, Rick. Yeah.
No, the beautiful thing about this situation is, like, I'm in a room with two very, very high-level riggers and technical guys that wrote their own tools, and I'm just like, I don't know how to rig, so like.
I mean, Rick, I am also here, and I also am a little bit too low level for this room, so. I feel you. We're here in solidarity. Right? So, jumping off of that question, for someone starting out relatively fresh, what is the best way to start animating with these workflows?
All right, you want me to jump in?
Yeah, why don't you jump in on that? Because I don't actually have, like, my answer is less satisfying, I think.
All right, so with my approach, like, so I'm not a tools guy. I can't do what Raph does, and I can't write a tool set, or Brad, or either. I can't do that. Like I wrote the one we're using at PolyArc, and my animators probably don't appreciate the fact that I wrote the one. We desperately want a real rigger, right? But so anyway, where I'm going with this is, you know, when I started out, I was working at Monolith, and we didn't have a rig there either. We were just kind of like my lead's like, hey, let me show you what this locator does and how you bake, and it's like, oh god, that's awesome. So then we just started working that way. So like the cool thing about space switching is you don't. You know, like you just need to know that I want to animate and roughly how to animate and generally where the buttons are in Maya, and you're good to go. Like you can use this process, and it's just a new way of seeing your animation data. You just got to understand what constraints are. You just got to understand how space affects the output data, like seeing your curves in world space versus relative, like having the foot relative to the head, which is a weird space. Why would you want that? But you could do that, right? And like, what would those curves look like, right? So then you start, you know, building off that, and it's really simple because it's in Maya. You can use any rig with this workflow, and then it's just essentially like learning a few basic concepts that you then start growing and turning into a pipeline. So, for example, like it would be very easy in my world, like if I wanted a character to do this and have the arms kind of react like that, I can just actually put the arms out in a static pose, move the character up and down, put aim targets on the FK upper arms, and then offset them in time. And then now I've got the nice overlap motion, right? So it's like really easy to learn basics like that. And if you can do it in that situation, well, how does it deal with swinging while running? And how do you do, and it's all just, it's right there in Maya. Maya Shift, there's no plugins, no tools, no nothing you'd need for this. You just learn how to do those spatial tricks, and then you just start doing them.
Well, I'll add to this before Raph gives an unsatisfactory answer. So you know, the ephemeral system is all about zero counter animation, and Richard's system is automated counter animation, right? Like controllable art directable counter animation to create time-based effects, right? That example of the hands and aiming and basically going, well, I have an existing motion, I want to push it to these other controls and offset them. And then it doesn't stay that way, though. I think that's what's you have to understand, is that when he gets that done, he then collapses it back to a transform of just a joint. The Raft system does that, but per frame, per interaction. He goes, well, I want the hands to follow the body when I transform it, and you move it and it positions the pose, and as soon as you're done doing that, it cooks and bakes and it's done. So you don't have to post bake it and, you know, manage time. Just your pose is exactly what it is as soon as you're done creating it. Just like putting a marker on a paper, that's it. It's permanent. You can sketch around another line or mess with the volume or add more sketches or darken something, but that's all immediate and on that pose, on that frame. And then you can push it out, right? Like, you know, with better ghosting tools and better like soft modification fall off of animation as a geometry, right? Like if we did it in ZBrush or KineFX, or, you know, you sculpted individual stop motion poses, right? Like, you know, it's a old replacement animation where you swap out each model, right? It's like that style, but the same thing is happening in both exact systems. It's just when it happens is different.
Right. And so my somewhat unsatisfying answer is that the reason why I had to actually develop this now, like I actually had to develop it as a tool, is because there isn't a way to get the specific thing that I wanted out of like any existing DCC. And what I wanted was that fast switch. The idea that you are just, you know, like as I'm moving, like every single movement, I might just like have my hand on the keyboard equivalents I've set up and just be like, you know, I'm doing an FK now. Now I'm going to just grab the hand, and now I'm an IK, and now I'm moving the torso, but I want the shoulders to be like, you know, isolated in rotation, and then I hit another key, and now they're not isolated in rotation. And like, I just want to be constantly changing so that posing is really fast.
And that's what we did.
And that is something that you can't get out of the box, right?
MotionBuilder is close.
MotionBuilder is close, but MotionBuilder has all of these other things that come with it in terms of how FBIK works, or HIK. I always forget which one is the correct term for the MotionBuilder version of it. Anyway, right? So what I do hope to do is like continue developing this. I'm developing the current version with Tagore Smith, and we certainly do intend to make it available to people at some point. You know, make it something I can give to other people in production, because as anyone who's developed tools will tell you, it's one thing to make some tools that you can use. It's one thing, and like I've been animating with the ephemeral system for like multiple years now in various versions of it. It's one thing to make tools that you can use. It's another thing to make tools that you can educate other people about, and that are easy for someone to get into enough that you can onboard animators into that workflow. So there's still work that needs to be done around that.
The actual question of how do you start if you're new, the easiest thing to do is find a rig that has IK switches and set everything to IK. And start getting comfortable with understanding how to actually pose a model and work frame to frame, right? Like if you can animate on 2, set your keys, stay in stepped, whatever it is, doesn't matter. But start relying on yourself, your skill as the animator to pose and sculpt the model and the rig, instead of relying on the rig to somehow magically interpolate and hope you get lucky on the next pose, right? Like, well, I left the spine in FK for now, and I got something that looks okay. I'm just going to leave that alone because I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up. Like that immediately puts you in a loop of 0 iteration and behind the curve on getting better at animating. So for Blender, there's a great tool called Rig on the Fly that is built around Richard's space switching workflow, and I've worked with him to expand the tool, but it basically makes a space switchable rig out of any FK skeleton. So you can just load up Blender, get the free add-on, and load up any skeleton you want, and you've got his system as a way to play with it. If you're using regular Maya rigs, guess what? Most of the animators, pro animators, are already using the same concepts. They just don't think about it. There are tools that are Locanator from CG Monks. There's all these tools that basically do 2 things. You pick a control that's animated, and it constrains it to a new node, and it bakes it over time, and then it lets you clean it up and it puts it back. And that functionality, I guarantee, if there's, I can't see the chat, but like all the pro animators in here are using Anim Tools functionality and the Locanator functionality to bake stuff off of their animation rig so that they can actually do what they want all the time. Like, you guys are already doing dense data work and you don't even really realize it, but you're having to do it per control and worry about what happens to your rig. These systems completely throw all that out. And honestly, on the Epic Mickey stuff, why it became a one-frame switch is because we had these complex animations that would be so hard to retime and adjust without breaking everything, and no one wanted to delete and start over, because then you lose all of the work. And that's the thing you learn from mocap, is that you don't have to start from scratch, but you also don't have to do what it's telling you. You start with the base foundation of, well, here is the overlap, the drag, the timing, the weight shift. The pose actually contains all the information. How do you use that information? Well, I can delete it and lose it all and re-keyframe it and hope I get close, or I can just push it into a state that I can deform it, right? You know, you start with a base model and you have a head that is nice topology, you deform it. You don't start from scratch with polygons each time, right? No one would ever get anything done. You scan, you know, their whole system's developed around this workflow. The same thing is applied to rigging, right? You can just set your rig to the simplest mode as possible and start animating. And then don't rely on the fact that, like, maybe you get lucky because something interpolated. Just set the pose, adjust the animation, turn on the new Maya Ghost editor if you can run cache playback, or, you know, use any of the other ghosting tools, and start thinking about how each pose relates to the other and how that gives you animation information, as opposed to hoping that somehow when I spline it, the graph editor won't mock you on Twitter.
You know, I think that's well said, and I think it comes down to seeing the possible spaces too, which is where Raf's thing comes in, which is really, I've always thought of like going in that direction with space switching already, which is like when you have a new animator looking at something. Like, I had a situation where a character was rolling on the ground, unconscious, right? And I really wanted to see the motion ripple up and down the body. And, you know, like, what space do you use to make that easy to do? And I was able to do it in just a few minutes, because I was able to put things like, okay, well, the target points are on the ground. That's my pivot point. And then I'm going to put aim targets up in the air, and then I'm going to convert the spine into like a spline IK space, and then have the nearest point follow these targets. And these targets are going to be generated based on the incoming motion. And I run some dynamics on it, bake it all down. I'm good to go. A few minutes later, it's all done. It's like knowing that's the appropriate space is the trick, right? So I think it's time, it's experience, it's using a process like this and getting your mind out of the idea of, well, the rig works like this, therefore that's my option, versus, well, ideally I'd work like this, therefore I'm going to have my rig function that way. And it's a completely different way of seeing animation. And the cool thing about Raf's approach is your click validates that, right? You click and then it converts you into the optimal space, and you don't have to think about it as much. Like with my process, that's the biggest problem, is knowing what space to be in, right? So whenever I'm training a new animator on this, obviously there's, you know, it crashes a lot because I wrote it, and there's UI missing because I never wrote any. But there's also like knowing what space you need to be in. And I think that's the biggest problem, because you can get so lost in, well, my traditional rig works like X, therefore X is my only choice.
Well, right. So like one of the things that I really wanted to achieve, and again, it's why these two approaches should really get merged, is the idea that if you choose a space, like, you're not locked into it for any more than just that one interaction, meaning that it's perfectly okay to not even necessarily have chosen the right one, right? You know, you're like, oh, well, that wasn't quite right, whatever, I'll just, you know, like, instantaneously, the very next moment, you're in the space that is actually best. So like, I think that your workflow could absolutely work that way. It would just take more development, and you know, it would be tricky to implement without, you know, without a lot of thought into essentially how to either make that work on top of Maya, or how to make that work as a completely new animation system. But in theory, like, these two things should work together very well.
Well, if it had fall off, right? Like Richard's example just now, he understood where his spaces were that he wanted, and he put the animation into that space for that section, rolling around on the ground. But if he rolled around on the ground and then popped up onto all fours and then like had to shoot off like Superman, well, then each of those would require maybe a different space, right?
Yeah, and that's actually the situation. Yeah, where the character came in, fell, was unconscious, then got up, right?
Right. And so you have to make the decision as the animator. But Raph's system is on click, it's done. So if you had on click with fall off, like, hey, this frame range, these are the appropriate transforms that are going to kind of fade in and out. A delta, that transform across the other keys, then that is the appropriate transform to alter the animation for those states. But I'm never locked into it. And that's what, I pointed out the giant software at Lightstorm, that was how it worked. You could, at any point on the mesh, I could click a button and it would generate a locator, and that locator was a new solver target. And you could have as many as you wanted per finger on the surface of the fingertip. You could seek it to itself, and it would, then you say, okay, well, how many frames is this important for? Well, he touches his shoulder here for 10 frames, and that's all I need the fingers to interact with. Generate the points, tell it lock down, set the delta time, and basically cook it across that. And now, as soon as he lets go, there's no rig. It was just, hey, help me out for these frames. Yep. But I'm not having to convert spaces. I'm just saying, no, you're going to alter the space of the animation so that this interaction is correct for this amount of time.
Yeah,
and it pushes it back. Yeah. But it only works with samples. You can't interpolate it because this will not interpolate correctly across time. It will only work if each pose across time is updated. You have to have dense data to make it work. And if you have tools that make that easy, you don't care because you're not like, I got to clean this up in the curves. No, you just look at your animation and lift the elbow and it's done.
Right, yeah.
Okay, and another question. With its constant baking, how does the ephemeral approach work in terms of performance versus current modes of animation, especially when applying it to very complex characters?
So, in terms of playback, it has absolutely no effect whatsoever. Because the control rig, I should be clear. Then there's a deformation rig underneath that, and there's other controls underneath that aren't ephemeral. But for the body control rig, at least as we have it now, it doesn't exist except when you're manipulating, basically. So it has no implications for playback at all. Now, in terms of the during interaction, the issue isn't really baking, because baking actually presupposes a set of assumptions that aren't actually true here, which is that if you think of baking, you're like, okay, well, I have some rig structure that exists, like it exists in the scene, and it's going to evaluate through the graph, and then at some point I need to take its current state and bake it. But that's actually not what's going on here at all. What's going on here is my manipulator is pushing data into my program, and its output is a bunch of states for these transforms. And so there's no baking really. It just sort of puts the transforms in various places, and then when it stops, that's where they are. But the program, of course, can have performance implications. And the version that I'm using right now is not optimized in the way that we intend it to be in the future. So there are some performance implications. But I don't think that they are, in theory, it can actually be very fast. And in many ways it is now. Because of the fact that it's very, very simple. So ultimately, if a more performant version were written, and I should note that in my rigs, I'm easily getting like 30 FPS interaction even so, but that would not be true for every kind of rig you could make, right? You could definitely make rigs that would load down the current system too much. But in theory, that doesn't have to be true, because the actual amount of math that my rigs have to do, that the ephemeral system has to do, is exceedingly limited compared to a conventional rig. Because you don't have all of this stuff that has to be built into it all the time. So, in the future, I do expect it to be very, very performant. And it already is a lot more performant than you'd probably expect for what it does.
It's the same for my rigs, too. It's essentially the only active space is the one you've got active, and it doesn't concurrently hold all of the data that the rig could possibly have in it simultaneously the way normal rigs would. You literally bake to that new space, and it deletes your old space.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The only other thing on performance is that, right now everyone's trying to make their current rigs faster, and when the rig isn't there, it's just the animation transform that's showing up on screen. It's going to be fast. Now, for like a face rig with like 300 joints, that's going to be heavier for rafts to calculate or take longer to respace if you had to. But, you know, having worked in MotionBuilder forever, it bakes really fast. So even when you have thousands of transforms and you're trying to like move animation curves between spaces, as long as the core software is fast, then it's not a problem. Maya is not there yet, and Blender sure isn't, and Houdini is not either. But, you know, MotionBuilder, that's why, like, even custom animation software, if you can bake fast for that kind of respacing, it's important. But, you know, that's the stuff I've had to work on is mocap gets long. So for animations, you know, when you're working on a shot-based system, you're not going to have that problem.
Right. I mean, you do just have all of these samples, and one of the other things is that, like, actually, the more stuff is ephemeral, the faster playback is, because you just don't have to evaluate all that stuff. Right. It's just a bunch of data across time. So I know that we're getting to the, you know, close to the end of our session, and I just wanted to note that we can continue answering questions on Discord afterwards. I mean, or at least I'm offering to do so. I can't speak for Rick and Brad. In, I think, the production voice channel. So if you know, we're about to like run out of time, but when we do, like, I'm happy to keep talking about it there.
Awesome. Sounds great. Yeah, because you have some great questions that I didn't get.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like, I'm sure we're able to hit like a small selection.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a very dense topic. So
yeah.
You guys named it very well.
If we can just sorry.
Yeah, I say so you have 2 minutes for this question, so please
spend
about that much time. But what sort of limitations exist in current 3D packages that hold back from this sort of idealized workflow, and how could they be better set up to avoid workarounds?
Brad, this is yours, man.
Bake speed and like processing speed and evaluation speed, right? Like for any kind of processing, the faster the software goes, the better it is. And Maya's getting there, right? Cache playback is not it, but it's faster with parallel and GPU. You know, for Richard's stuff, MotionBuilder's faster because it bakes faster, and Maya's trying. For Raf stuff, as long as his code is efficient, then it shouldn't be too big of a deal. But you know, he can speak to that.
Sure. Well, I mean, all right. So here's actually an example of how fast conceptually this system is. The current system's written in pure Python, and is still fast enough for me to be having 30 FPS interaction. If we like actually made it perform it would be really fast. Like, it would not be a concern. However, I mean, you still have all the other things that go along with a character, like all the deformation that Maya would evaluate. But you know, the other thing, though, that I think is worth noting about that is the thing that makes it difficult. A lot of it has to do with the structure of how those programs see things and how they do things. So, for instance, for me, like, I really want to deal with things as these discrete poses. But if you want to have stuff changing over time in Maya, keyframes are pretty much the way to do that. So underneath my system, there are actually keyframes, but it makes it complicates everything about interacting with them, and it complicates the question of how do I interact with multiple things.
Yeah,
because well, it's 5 o'clock now.
Yeah,
sorry, 5 o'clock on EST. We're done. We're moving to
can you guys do a really quick shout out of where people can find you if they want to talk to you more besides the AnimState Discord where you'll be answering questions?
Yep.
Go ahead, Brad.
All right, so I'll go first. I'm on Twitter at Fufanu. That's really the only social media I actually use.
Rigging Dojo, you can find me everywhere as, you know, linking back to Rigging Dojo. So I'll Twitter, Facebook, not so much, but Twitter and Discord.
You can go to my website at www.anzovin.com, and my blog is where I discuss most of the ephemeral rigging stuff. That's at just www.justtodosomethingBad.com, which is very ill-named. It's actually a Glenn Keane quote, but you can also just go to my website and link from there. That's probably easier. Also, I just wanted to know one thing, which is I just realized not everyone watching this necessarily knows where to go to, like, knows about the Discord.
I posted a link for the.
Oh, you posted a link. All right, great.
Yep. So it's the production voice channel in there, I believe, right? Or is there?
Okay.
Or is that a voice channel? It's the production channel.
It's a voice channel. That's why I was thinking of using it. And production seemed like the closest thing. So, you know.
Okay. Cool. Awesome.
So
Sounds
yeah,
good.
that's where I'll be on.
Thank you guys.
Thank you all.
It's been an
Yep.
honor.
Thank you.